She walked into a grocery store to buy rice. She walked out with a husband she didn't know, and a secret that could get her killed. A black single mother from Baltimore. A Korean Mafia boss hiding behind a business suit. One contract, 1 year. And a little boy who changed everything neither of them planned for. If this story pulls you in from the first scene, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The fluorescent lights inside Kwan's Asian market buzzed with that specific low-grade irritation that gave Fatima a headache every single time she walked through the door. She'd been coming here for 3 years, every other Saturday, sometimes every week when the bills weren't choking her, because the jasmine rice was $2 cheaper than the Kroger on North Avenue, and $2 was $2 when you were raising a child alone. Zion was at Mrs. Patterson's apartment downstairs. She'd promised him 45 minutes, an hour tops, and she was already at 38. The boy had a clock inside him that ran on disappointment. He could tell exactly how many minutes she was late with the kind of accuracy that broke her heart every time she saw his face through the peephole before she even got her key in the lock. She had a list. She always had a list. Jasmine rice, fish sauce, frozen dumplings because Zion had seen them in a YouTube video and asked about them for 6 consecutive days, and she'd finally given in. Ginger root, coconut milk. The small indulgences that made their apartment on Greenmount feel like a home instead of just a place where they slept. The rice aisle was in the back left corner, past the refrigerated tofu and the wall of instant noodle packages in languages she couldn't read. She turned the corner with her basket on her arm and her phone in her hand, checking the time, already doing the mental calculation of whether she could make it back before Zion's internal clock registered a betrayal. Then she stopped. There was a man standing in the middle of the aisle. Not browsing, not reading labels, not reaching for anything on the shelf, just standing there like someone had placed him in the center of the floor and forgotten to give him instructions. He was tall, well over 6 feet, dressed entirely in black, jacket, shirt, slacks, shoes, like he was attending a funeral or leaving one. His hands were clasped behind his back, his jaw was set. His eyes were moving slowly down the aisle in a way that had nothing to do with reading nutrition labels and everything to do with the habit of a man who checked every room he entered for exits. Korean, early 30s, maybe. Features sharp enough to cut glass. There was a stillness about him that Fatima's body registered before her brain caught up. The kind of stillness that didn't come from calm, but from a very precise, very practiced form of control. Like a weight held at the end of an outstretched arm. Not resting. Containing. 2 men stood at either end of the aisle. She almost hadn't noticed them because they were dressed like regular shoppers, one holding a basket, one with his hands in his jacket pockets. But neither of them was looking at anything on the shelves. They were looking at everything else. Fatima slowed her walk. Every instinct she'd developed over 34 years of navigating Baltimore. 34 years of reading rooms, reading men, reading the specific quality of silence that preceded something bad. Every one of those instincts fired at once. She kept walking anyway, because the rice was on that aisle, because she was already behind schedule, because she had learned a long time ago that the only thing more dangerous than walking toward a threat was letting a threat see you flinch. She reached for the 5-pound bag of jasmine rice without looking at him, checked the price, put it in her basket, reached for a second bag because she'd run low last week and regretted not buying extra. "You have a son." The voice came from directly behind her left shoulder, low and flat, accented but precise, like someone who had learned English from books and then spent years sanding down the rough edges. Fatima turned around slowly. He was closer than she'd expected, maybe 4 feet. He'd moved without making a sound, which should not have been possible for a man his size. "Excuse me?" she said. He wasn't looking at her with interest. He wasn't looking at her the way men sometimes looked at her in grocery stores, why, the slow slide of eyes that she'd learned to cut short with a look of her own. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a document they're trying to decide whether to sign. 8 years old, he said. "You have a photograph on your phone case." She looked down at her phone. There was Zion. Gap-toothed smile, Orioles cap slightly crooked, the one from his second-grade school picture that she'd ordered in every size they offered because she couldn't help herself. She looked back up at the man. "I'm going to need you to back up," she said. He took one step back. Exactly one. My name is Kang Min Jae. Good for you. I need a wife. The words landed so flat and so ordinary that for a full 2 seconds she thought she'd misheard him. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere at the end of the aisle, one of the two men shifted his weight. I'm sorry, Fatima said. You need a what? A wife, by tomorrow morning. She stared at him for a long moment. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't add anything to soften the sentence or indicate that it had been a joke. You need professional help, she said. That's what you need. She turned back toward the aisle. The arrangement would be contractual, he said to her back. 1 year. You and your son would be provided for completely. Housing, food, security, medical care, education. At the end of the year, the contract dissolves and you receive a settlement sufficient to establish permanent financial stability. Your son would be treated as family for the duration. No harm would come to either of you. You have my word. Fatima did not turn around. Her hand was on a bag of rice she was no longer thinking about. Her heart was doing something she didn't have a clean word for. Not fear. She'd felt fear. She knew what it tasted like, and this wasn't it. Not excitement either, though something underneath the anger she was keeping herself wrapped in was moving in a way she didn't trust. She thought about the electric bill. The number she'd been pretending wasn't as bad as it was. The conversation she'd had with her landlord last Tuesday, the one she'd ended with a forced smile and a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The way Zion had stopped asking for things. Not the big things, but the small things. The birthday party invitations to places that cost money. The field trips with permission slips she signed but had to save for in advance. Stopped asking in that way children stop asking when they've started to understand that the answer is probably no. She turned around. You don't know me, she said. I know enough. That's a terrifying thing to say to a woman in a grocery store. Yes, he agreed, without any indication that he found this problematic. She studied his face. There was nothing readable in it. No anxiety, no desperation, no sign that he was aware of how insane this conversation was. Just that same flat, contained expression, like a man delivering a business proposal he expected to be accepted because the terms were objectively sound. Why me? She said. Specifics of the arrangement require a different conversation. Tonight, if you're willing. If not. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, plain white, just a phone number, and held it out. Call when you're ready to hear more. She didn't take it right away. What happens if I say no right now and walk out of here? You walk out, nothing happens. You never hear from me again. He said it simply, and she believed him, which was the strangest part. But you'll spend the rest of the evening thinking about what I said. She took the card. He inclined his head, not quite a bow, something less formal than that, a gesture she didn't have a framework for, and walked past her toward the end of the aisle where one of his men fell into step beside him. The other followed from the opposite direction. Within 15 seconds, all three of them were gone, and the rice aisle was just a rice aisle again, with its buzzing lights and its stacked shelves, and the faint smell of dried mushrooms from the section 2 rows over. Fatima stood there for a moment. Then she put the rice in her basket and went to find the fish sauce. She called at 9:47 p.m. after Zion was asleep. She didn't know why she called. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself it was the same impulse that made her read the last page of a thriller before she'd finished it, needing to know the shape of the thing before she committed to it. She told herself it had nothing to do with the electric bill notice she'd found tucked behind the fruit bowl when she was making dinner, the one she'd put there face down 3 days ago because looking at it straight on required energy she didn't have. He answered on the second ring. I'll meet you, she said. Somewhere public. I'm bringing a friend. That's reasonable, he said. I still think you're insane. Also reasonable. They met at a Korean restaurant on Howard Street, her choice, at a corner table. She brought Denise, her best friend since Howard University, who worked as a paralegal and had the specific ability to smell lies the way some people smelled rain. Denise sat across from Min Jae with her arms folded and her eyes narrowed, and Fatima sat beside her, and on the other side of the restaurant, 2 men in dark jackets sat at a table near the door and drank water and watched. Min Jae laid out the terms without preamble. He was getting married. The marriage needed to exist and needed to appear real. The duration was 1 year, renewable by mutual agreement but obligatory on neither side. In exchange, full financial provision for Fatima and Zion for the duration, relocation to Seoul, accommodations, a monthly allowance that made Denise's pen stop moving on her legal pad, and upon completion of the contract, a lump sum payment that made Fatima's vision go briefly sideways. Healthcare, Denise said flatly. Full coverage, both of them. Yes, Min-jae said. The child's education. Private school enrollment. Language support. Any specialist he requires. What kind of business are you in, Mr. Kang? Denise asked. Import and export. That's a very wide answer. Yes. Denise looked at Fatima. Fatima looked at the table. There was a long silence, and in that silence she could hear, with uncomfortable clarity, every specific financial anxiety she had carried for the past 4 years. Since Marcus left, since the job at the hospital cut her hours, since Zion's therapist said he was doing well but regular sessions would really help, since every month felt like running a race she'd started 20 yards behind the starting line. I need 48 hours, she said. I need 24, he said. Why tomorrow? A matter that requires resolution by a specific date. He didn't elaborate. She noted that he didn't lie either. He didn't invent a more palatable explanation. He simply declined to give the real one. She noted that too. 36 hours, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Agreed. She spent 12 of those 36 hours sleeping, badly, and the other 24 doing the kind of thinking that didn't happen in straight lines. She sat on the edge of her bathtub at 2 a.m. and made a list on her phone of every reason to say no. And it was a good list, a long list, a list that would have made any rational person fold the card in half and throw it in the trash. She didn't know him. She didn't know what he did. She didn't know Seoul. She didn't speak Korean. She was asking Zion to leave his school, his room, Mrs. Patterson downstairs, the 2 friends he'd made that year who came over on weekends and ran in circles until they were sweating. She was asking herself to leave the only city she'd ever lived in. And then she sat on the couch in the living room at 6 a.m. with the electric bill in her hand, the real number, the face-up number, and Zion's report card from 2 months ago, the one with the teacher's note that said Zion is bright and curious, but I've noticed he sometimes seems anxious about things children his age shouldn't carry, and the form from his school about the upcoming overnight trip that she'd put in a drawer because the cost was something she was going to figure out. She called Min-jae at 6:43. Yes, she said. A pause. I'll send someone to help with the packing. I can pack my own things. I know. Another pause. The wedding is at 10. This morning? Yes. She looked at the ceiling. You are the most out-of-pocket person I have ever met in my life. The arrangements are handled. A car will come at 8. She ended the call and sat in the silence of her apartment. The particular silence of early morning, Zion still asleep, the heat kicking on in the walls, a garbage truck somewhere on the street below. And she felt something she didn't have a clean name for. Not peace, not certainty. Something more like the feeling she'd had the day she brought Zion home from the hospital, terrified and exhausted and holding a thing that was hers to protect whether she felt ready or not. She stood up and went to wake her son. She'd thought about what to say on the walk to his room. She'd been thinking about it since 2 a.m, cycling through explanations, rehearsing tones, trying to land somewhere between honest and not terrifying. She sat on the edge of his bed and watched him surface from sleep, the way he always did, slow and reluctant, like sleep was something he didn't want to let go of. And she waited until his eyes were open and he'd looked at her long enough to understand she was serious. I need to talk to you about something big, she said. Zion rubbed his eyes. He was 8, but sometimes in the early morning, before the day got to him, he looked younger. He looked like the baby she'd carried home from Johns Hopkins in a carrier she'd borrowed from Denise, terrified she was going to do something wrong. How big? Very big. Maybe moving to another country big. He stared at her. Which country? South Korea. He thought about this with the gravity that Zion brought to most major announcements. He was not a child who rushed to reactions. Is that near Japan? Yes. Do they have dinosaurs there? Not live ones. He seemed to accept this. Why? She took a breath. I met someone. He's from Korea. We're going to get married today, and then we're going to go live there for a year. And after the year, we'll figure out what comes next. His name is Min Jae, and I need you to trust me that this is the right choice for us." Zion looked at her for a long time with those steady dark eyes that sometimes made her feel like she was the child, and he was something older and wiser wearing her son's face. "Did you check him out?" he said. "What?" "Like how you check out movies before we watch them. Did you check if he's good or not?" "I'm still figuring that out," she said. "But I think so." Another long pause. "Okay," he said. "Can I bring my dinosaur books?" "You can bring everything you want." He sat up. "Is there breakfast?" The wedding was not what she'd expected, which meant she'd been wrong about every version of what she'd expected. She'd expected courthouse sterility. She'd expected a quick transaction with the emotional temperature of a notary appointment. She'd gotten something that was technically a courthouse, a small ceremony room in a building downtown that she didn't recognize, with a city official who spoke Korean and a translator who stood slightly behind him. But there were flowers on the table, white and cream, fresh, professionally arranged, and a detail that small landed with a weight completely out of proportion to its size. Denise stood behind her. She'd shown up at the apartment at 7:30 without being asked, wearing her best blazer, because Denise was the kind of person who showed up. Min Jae was already there when they arrived. He'd changed. Dark suit, no tie, still entirely in black and dark tones, but there was something slightly different in how he stood, a fraction less of the military quality that had made the rice aisle feel like a border crossing. He looked at her when she walked in, and for a single second she saw something shift behind his eyes. Something she couldn't read, but that was clearly not nothing. Zion stood beside Fatima and held her hand. He'd worn his good sneakers and combed his hair without being asked, both of which told her he understood the seriousness of the day, even if he was holding it quietly. The ceremony was 11 minutes. She signed 4 documents she'd reviewed with Denise the night before: a translated version, a legal summary, a contract addendum, the official certificate. Min Jae signed the same documents. The city official said something formal in Korean. The translator repeated it in English. She said yes at the correct moment. So did he. When it was done, Min Jae turned to Zion. He crouched down, not perfunctorily, not the patronizing half-bend adults sometimes did when they couldn't be bothered to fully commit. Fully crouched, hands on his knees until he was at eye level with an 8-year-old. "My name is Min Jae," he said. "You can call me whatever you're comfortable with. I won't tell you what to call me." Zion studied him the way he studied everything serious, not with suspicion exactly, more with the careful evaluation of someone taking inventory. "Do you know about dinosaurs?" Min Jae looked at him steadily. "Not very much." "You can teach me." Zion seemed to weigh this. "Okay," he said. "I know a lot." "Good." Min Jae stood back up. He didn't smile, but something around his eyes shifted slightly, and Fatima watched it happen without understanding what she was watching. Dum-dum. The flight was 14 hours. She'd flown twice in her life before, once to Atlanta for a cousin's wedding when she was 19, once to New York for a nursing conference at 28, and both times she'd been in the back of the plane in a middle seat with her knees touching the row in front of her. This plane didn't have rows in the conventional sense. This plane had seats that reclined into beds. There were individual screens, a selection of food served on real plates with real metal silverware, and a flight attendant who appeared at intervals with the specific kind of attention that comes from being paid very well to anticipate needs before they're spoken. Zion fell asleep inside the first 2 hours with his dinosaur book open across his chest, and Fatima sat awake next to him and watched him sleep and tried to understand what she had done. Min Jae sat across the aisle and slightly forward, not sleeping, working through documents on a tablet. Every hour or so he looked across at them, just once, a brief check, the way someone checks an instrument panel. Not warm, not cold, simply present and monitoring. At some point past the 10-hour mark, when the cabin had settled into that specific stillness of a cross-continental night flight, and Zion had turned sideways in his reclined seat, with his arm flung over his head, Fatima became aware that Min Jae had moved. He was now in the seat across from hers, 1 row back from where Zion was sleeping. "You should rest," he said. His voice was lower, adjusted to the quiet of the cabin. "I'm fine." "You're not." He said it without rudeness, Just the same flat precision he applied to everything. "You're afraid." She looked at him. "What I am is a woman who signed a legal document this morning that she met 72 hours ago. I think a reasonable amount of alertness is warranted." "Yes." He looked out the small oval window at the darkness outside. "I don't blame you for it. I don't need you to not blame me." He turned back from the window and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the cabin hummed around them with the low white noise of altitude and speed and distance accumulating in the dark. "Tell me something true," she said. He seemed to consider this with genuine attention rather than deflecting it. "I have never done something like this before," he said. "I don't enjoy performing things I don't believe in. The arrangement was necessary. I wanted someone who was—" He paused, searching for something specific. "Not performing either." "What does that mean?" "It means most of the women I would have been directed toward understood exactly what was expected of them and would have executed it with considerable expertise. I didn't want that." "So you went to a grocery store in Baltimore." "I was in Baltimore for a meeting. The store was on the way back to the hotel." A beat. "It was coincidence." "You don't seem like someone who believes in coincidence." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't." She didn't know what to do with that, so she looked out her own window at the same dark. Somewhere below them, an ocean she'd never seen was moving without any concern for the question she couldn't answer. "Minjae?" she said. "Yes." "What exactly are you?" The pause before he answered was not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3, but inside it, she felt the weight of a door that hadn't been opened yet. "Someone who handles problems," he said, "but that's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He stood up and moved back to his original seat and went back to his documents, and she sat in the dark with the particular loneliness of 34,000 feet, and a husband she didn't know, and a son sleeping beside her with his arm over his head. And somewhere underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the carefully controlled panic she was managing one breath at a time, something else moved, small and uninvited and entirely unwelcome. Curiosity. Chapas. Seoul arrived the way large things arrive. Not all at once, but in pieces. The car from the airport was black and long, different from any car service she'd taken. The driver didn't speak. Minjae sat in the front and spent the ride on his phone, speaking in Korean, his voice quiet and controlled and carrying the specific register of a man giving instructions rather than receiving them. Zion pressed his face to the window with the unguarded awe of a child encountering a city that had no category in his previous experience. The scale of it, the towers, the density, the rivers of lit signage, in a language that looked to him like decoration, which he announced at one point with complete sincerity, seemed to reconfigure something in him in real time. The building they stopped at didn't look like an apartment building from the outside. It looked like a building that other buildings were deferential to. A man came out to the car before they'd fully stopped, opened the door, and addressed Minjae in Korean in a tone that Fatima's brain automatically filed under professional subordinate before she'd consciously parsed anything about it. The elevator required a key card. The apartment, penthouse, she would understand later when she found a moment alone to process the square footage, had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a city that spread in every direction like something she'd been told about but hadn't actually believed. Glass and light, and the dark ribbon of the Han River, and bridges lit against the water, and above it, faintly, a sky she'd never seen from this height. Zion walked to the window and stood there with his mouth slightly open. Minjae stopped beside Fatima at the edge of the main room. "Your rooms are on the left side. I'm on the right. There's staff, a housekeeper, a cook, 2 household security." He caught her expression. "They've been briefed. They'll treat you and Zion as family. If anyone gives you a problem, you come to me." "I know you don't need protection," he said, and it wasn't sycophantic. It was direct, an acknowledgement without condescension. "I'm telling you in case the situation ever comes up anyway." She looked at him. He was looking at Zion at the window. "He's going to ask about the dinosaur museum," she said. "There's a natural history museum 40 minutes from here," he said. "The paleontology section is the largest in Asia." She stopped. "How do you know that?" He turned back toward the right side of the apartment. "I looked it up on the plane," he said. already walking away. She stood there for a moment in the entryway of a penthouse apartment in a city she couldn't navigate, legally married to a man who handled problems in ways he wouldn't specify, with her 8-year-old son's face reflected in the floor-to-ceiling glass. And she felt the world she'd built, painstaking and careful and exhausting, and hers, recede behind her like something seen through the rear window of a car moving too fast to stop. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about the men she would start noticing in the coming weeks, the ones who stood outside closed doors during meetings that went quiet when she walked past, the ones with scars they didn't explain, and eyes that moved with the habit of a particular profession. She didn't know about the conversation she would hear 6 weeks from now through a door she should have kept walking past. She didn't know that every piece of the careful, controlled life that Min-jae presented to her was the surface of something much deeper, much older, and much more dangerous than anything she had the framework to understand. What she knew, standing in that entryway, was that her son was pressing his hand flat against the glass of a window 40 stories above a city in South Korea and whispering something she couldn't hear, and that the sound of that, small and private and entirely Zion, was the realest thing in the room. She followed it forward, because that was what she'd always done. Forward, one foot, then the next, even when she couldn't see the ground. 3 days passed, then a week, and Seoul did what cities do. It became familiar in increments, the way cold water becomes bearable when you enter it slowly enough. The housekeeper, a woman named Ji-young, who communicated primarily through brisk efficiency and the occasional precise nod, brought coffee to Fatima's room every morning at 7 without being asked. The cook prepared food that was extraordinary in the specific way that things prepared by someone who has cooked seriously for years are extraordinary. Not showy, but considered, each meal a small evidence of attention. Zion adjusted with the alarming resilience of childhood. Within 4 days, he had established a working relationship with every member of household staff, not through strategy, but through the specific gravity of a child who made eye contact with adults and asked them questions about themselves. Ji-young, who had given no indication of having a personality outside of operational competence, spent 20 minutes one afternoon showing Zion photographs of her sister's dog on her phone. Fatima watched this from the kitchen doorway and felt something she couldn't quite categorize. Min-jae was present and absent in equal measure. He left early, sometimes before 6, sometimes she didn't hear him leave at all, and returned at hours that varied without pattern. When he was home, he was in his study, or on calls she could hear as low murmur through the wall but could not parse, or at the dining table with documents spread across it in a way that suggested he used the table as an extension of whatever workspace lived in his head. He ate dinner with them 3 times that first week. Not always, not every night, but enough that she couldn't pretend it wasn't intentional. The first time, Zion talked for 40 minutes about the Cretaceous period without pausing except to inhale. Min-jae listened with the same quality of focused attention he gave to his documents. Entirely present, not performing interest, asking questions at intervals that were specific enough to indicate he was actually tracking the information rather than simply waiting for a pause. After Zion went to bed that first night, Fatima carried the empty water glasses to the kitchen, and Min-jae was already there, rinsing his cup at the sink with the automatic competence of someone who had lived alone long enough to develop habits. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Ji-young, I've been rinsing my own cup since I was 19, he said, without turning around. She put the glasses in the sink beside him and stood there for a moment in the specific awkwardness of a kitchen that had been designed for solitude, now containing 2 people who had no practiced language for each other. "He likes you," she said. Min-jae turned off the water, looked at the wall in front of him for a moment rather than at her. "He's a good kid. Don't condescend to him," she said. "He'll know." He turned to look at her then, something shifting in his expression. Not offense, more like recognition. "I know," he said. "I won't." She believed him. That was what was starting to unsettle her. She kept believing things about him. The second week, she found the first thing that didn't fit. She had been walking back from Zion's room after putting him to bed, taking the longer route through the main living area because she was still not entirely comfortable with the layout. The apartment was large in ways she hadn't yet fully mapped, and she passed the hallway that led to a wing she'd been told was storage and secondary meeting space, and she heard voices. She would have kept walking. She was tired, it was late, and she had learned quickly enough that this apartment contained pockets of conversation she wasn't part of. But one of the voices rose above the others with the specific edge of barely controlled anger, and the other voice came down on top of it with a weight so sudden and absolute that the first voice stopped immediately. And both of those sounds were recognizable in a way that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the universal grammar of power and its enforcement. She kept walking. But in her room, sitting on the edge of the bed, she turned the sound of those voices over in her mind for a long time before she slept. The second thing she found was less subtle. The third Wednesday after their arrival, she came out of the elevator in the building's lobby returning from a walk. She'd been building a mental map of the surrounding blocks, establishing the small geography of routine that made unfamiliar places livable. And there were 3 men in the lobby who had not been there when she left. They were not the building's security. The building's security wore uniforms and stood at a desk. These men wore jackets and stood near the elevator with their hands visible, and they looked at her with the particular alertness of men who had been told to expect her. One of them inclined his head, a gesture that telegraphed, without words, that she was recognized, that she was expected to proceed, that they would not stop her, but they were noting her arrival and departure. She went up in the elevator and stood in the kitchen and made a cup of tea and set it on the counter without drinking it and stood there for a long time. Minji came home 2 hours later. He walked in and found her at the kitchen table with the cold cup of tea in front of her, and he stopped in the doorway and read her expression with the speed of a man very practiced at assessing situations. "Who were the men in the lobby?" she said. He set his keys down on the counter, took off his jacket. "They were there for a meeting." "With you?" "Yes." "They looked at me like they already knew who I was." He looked at her directly. "You're my wife." "I'm your contract wife," she said. "Which is different." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected him to remain standing, to remain in the mode of someone fielding a concern before moving to the next task. He sat down and he looked at her and he said, "What do you want to know?" "What kind of meetings require men standing in a lobby with their hands where you can see them?" A long pause. She watched him make a decision. She could see it happening, the internal calculation, the weighing of what to offer against what to withhold. "The kind that involve people who require that level of security," he said. "That's not an answer." "No." "You keep doing that?" "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. "There are things I'll tell you when the time is right. There are things you're better protected by not knowing. I'm not willing to lie to you, but I'm not—" He stopped, something tightening briefly in his jaw. "I'm not ready to have this conversation yet." She studied him across the table. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere in the apartment, the air system made its low, continuous sound. "Okay," she said. He looked up. "Okay," she said again. "Not ready yet, but the conversation is coming." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "It is." She picked up the cold tea, remembered it was cold, set it back down. "Zion wants to go to the dinosaur museum this weekend," she said. "He's been building up to asking you since Tuesday." Something moved very slightly at the corner of Min-jae's mouth. Not a smile, not quite, or not yet, or not in the way smiles usually arrived, but something adjacent to it, something that came from a place behind the controlled surface of his face that didn't usually let things out. "Saturday?" he said. "I'll have the morning free." She nodded. He stood up, took his jacket from the counter, and started toward his study. At the doorway he paused. "Fatima." She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for not pushing tonight." She didn't answer, and he went into his study and the door closed, and she sat at the kitchen table in a penthouse in Seoul that was beginning to feel, with terrifying gradualism, like somewhere she lived. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city moved through its night, indifferent and enormous, and the Han River caught the light the way rivers always do, silver and shifting, carrying everything that falls into it toward someplace else. She didn't know yet what was gathering in the dark beyond those windows. She didn't know yet the name Kang Tae-hyun, or what it would eventually mean to her life, or the shape of the conversation that was 6 weeks away and moving toward her with the patience of something that had already decided to arrive. What she knew was this: She was 34 years old, and she had made a reckless choice, and she had brought her son with her into it, and somewhere in this apartment, on the other side of a wall, the man she had married was awake at 11:30 at night, doing work she couldn't name, in a world she couldn't yet see. And the fact that she wanted to see it, the fact that she wanted to understand it, wanted to understand him, wanted to sit at that table across from him until the conversation he wasn't ready for became the one he couldn't hold back any longer. That fact, small and undeniable and arriving uninvited, was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she'd walked into a rice aisle on a Saturday afternoon and made the mistake of not turning around. Well, the museum trip happened on a cold Saturday morning 3 weeks into their life in Seoul, and it was the day Fatima stopped being able to pretend. Not about Min Jae in general. She'd been managing her awareness of him the way you manage a light that's too bright, looking slightly to the side of it. She'd been doing that for weeks. But the museum trip was different. The museum trip was the day she saw what was underneath the surface he showed the world. Zion had been talking about it since Monday. Specific exhibits he'd researched online, specific questions he wanted answered, the whole thing organized in his mind with the thoroughness that characterized everything Zion cared about. He'd made a list, written in his notebook with the slightly too large handwriting of a child who was still learning to make letters stay where he put them. Min Jae drove. He drove himself. No driver, which surprised her, in a car that was understated enough to seem deliberately chosen, and Zion sat in the back and talked about bone density in the T-Rex skeleton from the front entrance photograph he'd found online. Min Jae kept his eyes on the road and asked, about a quarter of the way there, what made the T-Rex's arms so ineffective relative to its body mass. Zion talked for 11 minutes without stopping. Min Jae absorbed it, asked a follow-up question about the relationship between the arms and the animal's center of gravity. Got another 8 minutes. In the passenger seat, Fatima looked out the window at Seoul moving past and pressed her thumbnail into her palm and breathed. The museum was vast. Zion moved through it at a pace that was simultaneously unhurried. He needed time with everything, and inexorable, a small deliberate current moving toward each exhibit with the calm certainty of a person who knows exactly where they're going. Min Jae walked beside him. Not behind, not leading. Beside, slightly bent forward to account for the height difference, and he looked at what Zion looked at, and listened to what Zion said, and asked questions that were never condescending and never performative. She walked on Zion's other side and watched. At the large Jurassic display, the centerpiece of the hall, skeletons articulated in mid-motion, Zion stopped and looked up for a long time without speaking, which was unusual enough that both adults slowed beside him. "What are you thinking?" Min Jae asked. Zion looked at the bones. "That it was alive," he said, "like all those bones were inside something that breathed. And now there's nothing left except the hard parts." A beat of silence. "That's a good thing to notice," Min Jae said. Zion looked up at him. Then he reached over, without particular ceremony, and took Min Jae's hand. The gesture landed like something falling from a height. Min Jae looked down at Zion's hand in his, and something moved through his face that was not controlled and not performative, and not any version of the contained, precise man she had been watching from a careful distance for 3 weeks. It lasted only a second, the duration of a single breath, before his expression settled back into its habitual neutrality. But she had seen it, and standing in the Jurassic Hall of a natural history museum in Seoul, with the bones of something enormous and ancient suspended above her, Fatima felt the careful distance she'd been maintaining, close like a door pushed shut by the wind. She was in trouble. That was the clear, specific thought that arrived in that moment, unadorned and unarguable. She was in very serious trouble, and it had nothing to do with anything she'd yet discovered about what Kang Min Jae actually was, the truth of him, the depth of the thing he was protecting her from knowing. None of the things that were coming in the weeks ahead, the conversations through closed doors, the revelation that would detonate everything she thought she understood. None of that had happened yet, but it was coming. 3 weeks from now, she would stand outside a door. She should have kept walking past, and what she heard on the other side would shatter the version of this life she had been carefully, foolishly, beginning to believe in. The bones of something long dead hung above them in the cold museum air, suspended between falling and flight, preserved in the exact posture of a moment that would never be undone. Fatima looked at Min Jae. Minjae looked at Zion, and the clock, though none of them could hear it, was already running. The week after the museum, something shifted in the apartment's atmosphere the way pressure shifts before weather. Not visible yet, but present in the body, in the way the air moved differently through the rooms, in the way the silences between them had changed their quality from uncomfortable to something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. Fatima noticed it in small things first. The way Minjae paused in doorways now, when he found her already in a room, not long, half a second at most, before continuing in. The way he'd started leaving his coffee cup on the kitchen counter in the morning, rather than immediately rinsing it, which she understood without being told was not negligence, but some small, unconscious relaxation of the habits of solitude. The way Zion had begun, without announcement or ceremony, to drop his backpack on the floor of Minjae's study after school and do his homework there, and the way Minjae had begun, with equal lack of ceremony, to simply work around him. These were small things. She cataloged them carefully, the way you catalog things you're not sure yet are evidence of something. Because she knew about evidence. She'd grown up watching her mother catalog small signs too. The good ones, back when there were good ones, before things had gone the way they went. And she had inherited that same steady, watchful quality of attention. The ability to read the architecture of a situation before it became legible to anyone else. What she was reading now was something she was not prepared to name yet. The call came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the museum. She was in the kitchen making Zion's after-school snack when she heard Minjae's voice from the study. Not the low modulated tone of a regular call, but something sharper, a quality she hadn't heard before, something compressed and angular at the edges. The door was not fully closed. She could hear the cadence without the words, the rhythm of Korean rising and falling with the specific percussion of a conversation that was not going as the speaker intended. She sliced the apple. The voice on the other end of Minjae's call was briefly audible, not loud enough to parse, but loud enough to register as aggressive. She heard that much. She heard the specific music of someone pushing. Minjae's response came back level and slow, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone choosing exactly where to set their weight. Then silence. Then the sound of the call ending. When he came into this kitchen 20 minutes later, he was wearing the same expression he always wore, the controlled one, the one that gave nothing. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was working, a muscle tightening and releasing in a rhythm too small to be intentional, too consistent to be accidental. "Snacks on the counter," she said, without looking up from the cutting board. "I don't need—" "It's not for you. It's for Zion." She looked up then. "He gets home in 30 minutes. He looked at the plate on the counter. "Right." He poured water from the pitcher, drank half of it standing there, and set the glass down. "I need to go out tonight." "Okay. I'll be back before midnight." "Minjae?" She set the knife down. "You don't have to give me your schedule. We're not—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I don't need check-ins." He looked at her for a moment. The muscle in his jaw moved once. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you anyway." He left the kitchen. She heard the study door close again. She picked up the knife and finished the apple and stood at the counter and breathed through her nose, slow and deliberate, the way she'd learned to breathe when the anxiety came, not panic, just the specific weight of a situation developing in a direction she couldn't predict. He was home by 11:40. She knew because she was awake, not intentionally waiting, but awake in the way she was often awake at that hour. Zion had been sleeping through the night since he was 4, but she never quite had, her body running a low-level watch even after the need for it was technically gone. She heard the elevator. She heard the front door. She heard his footsteps cross the main room. And then she heard him stop. She lay still, listening. He stood outside Zion's door for a moment. She could tell by the specific location of the silence, the particular quality of stillness that comes from a person rather than from empty space. He stood there maybe 30 seconds. Then she heard him move away. She stared at the ceiling in the dark and did not think about what that meant. She was very careful in those minutes not to think about what that meant. The second call happened 4 days later. This time she was closer. She had been walking down the hallway toward the main living area, and she heard him before she reached the turn. In the secondary meeting room, the door cracked 2 inches. And this time the voice on the other end of his call was loud enough that she caught tones, even if not language. And this time Min Jae was not keeping his voice down. She should have kept walking. Every reasonable part of her understood she should have kept walking. She stopped. His Korean was rapid and flat, sanded of inflection, and even without understanding the words, she could read the structure of it. The way a sentence can be a wall, each word another stone, laid fast and precise, and with no interest in being climbed. And then the other voice again, and this time she caught two words she recognized. She'd been studying Korean for 3 weeks. Zion had started lessons, and she'd been following along with a borrowed workbook, and whatever her phone could teach her in the early mornings before the household woke. She caught two words. One was her name. Her name in the mouth of whoever was on that call rendered with a specific quality, not neutral, not respectful, the quality of something being referenced as a complication. The other word was a Korean word she'd looked up once in passing and remembered because it was short and ugly sounding and the definition had sat badly with her. The word meant temporary. She made herself move. She made herself continue down the hallway with her footsteps even, and her face arranged into something that could pass for normal, and she walked to the kitchen and put her hands flat on the counter and breathed. She wasn't sure how long she stood there. When Min Jae came into the kitchen, she heard him stop in the doorway the way he always stopped now, that half-second calibration. She didn't turn around. "Who's calling you?" she said. Silence behind her. "It keeps happening," she said. "Whoever it is, they're not happy, and they're not someone you can cut off, and they said my name." She heard him come further into the kitchen. She heard him set something on the counter. His phone, by the sound of it. "Fatima, don't say my name like that." "Like what?" "Like you're about to manage me." She turned around then because she'd learned by now that having this conversation with her back to him was a disadvantage she didn't need to give herself. "I'm not a situation to manage. I'm the person living in this apartment and eating at your table and raising my son inside whatever this is, and I deserve to know who is calling you and what they're saying about me." He looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing what his face did. Containing, always containing, but there was something in it tonight that was different from the usual quality of his control. Something that looked less like composure and more like a man holding a door shut against something that wanted to come through. "His name is Kang Tae-hyun," he said. "He's my cousin." "Okay." "He has a stake in—" He stopped. "In the organization I run. The import-export business." The pause was brief. "Yes." "And he's unhappy about me." "He's unhappy about the marriage." "Why?" Min Jae looked at the window, looked back at her. "Because it affects certain arrangements that were in place before the marriage. Succession arrangements." She studied him. He was telling her something and not telling her something at the same time, and she was tired. Genuinely physically tired. The kind of tired that accumulated from weeks of processing a life that gave her no reliable framework to stand on. And the tiredness made her less careful than she normally would have been. "Is Taehyun dangerous?" she said. Min Jae answered without hesitation. "Yes." The word hit the room like something dropped on a hard floor, clean and final, and making a sound that didn't fade. "To me?" she said. "To Zion?" "Not while I'm here." He said it with the same flatness, same precision, the weight of a man stating something he knows to be factually true and personally guaranteed. "Not ever, if I can prevent it. That's not a—" He seemed briefly to search for something. "That's not a comfort I'm offering. It's a commitment." She looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. The city ran its light against the windows. "Min Jae," she said, "what exactly are you the boss of?" The muscle in his jaw. The door he was holding. "I'll tell you," he said. "I will tell you everything, but not tonight." "You keep saying that." "I know." "When?" He held her gaze. "When I'm sure it won't make you take Zion and leave." The honesty of that, the specific, unguarded quality of that sentence, so unlike everything else he offered, stopped her the way an unexpected sound stops you, the body catching up to meaning before the mind does. She didn't push. She looked at him for another long moment, and then she said, "Taehyun calls again. I want to know." And she walked out of the kitchen, and behind her she heard him let out a breath, slow and controlled, the sound of a door that had been held a little longer than the person holding it had planned. She called Denise the next morning, not for advice. She knew what Denise would say. Denise had been saying it in increasingly pointed text messages for 2 weeks, each one containing a slightly different arrangement of the same core concern. She called because she needed a voice that belonged to her previous life, needed the specific frequency of someone who had known her before all of this, who held a version of her that hadn't yet learned to read Korean threat levels through closed doors. "Tell me something normal," she said when Denise picked up. "Mrs. Patterson asked about you and Zion yesterday," Denise said. "She made me take a piece of sweet potato pie home and I ate the whole thing in my car in the parking garage." Fatima laughed. The laugh surprised her, came out real and sudden, the kind that doesn't consult with you first. "How is she?" "Dramatic? Her hip is fine, she just likes the attention." A pause. "How are you actually?" "I don't know." "That means things are happening." "Things are always happening." "Fatima, I'm fine, Dee." "You called me at 7 in the morning Seoul time to tell me you're fine?" She looked out the window at the river. The morning light was doing something particular to the water, a flat silver quality that was not quite beautiful and not quite bleak, something exactly in between. "He's not what I thought he was," she said, "meaning worse. Meaning—" She stopped. "Meaning I don't know what the edges of it are. I know there's more. I know it's serious. I know people are afraid of him in a way that isn't about his personality." She pressed her finger against the cold glass. "And Zion loves him, Dee." The silence from Baltimore had a specific texture. "That's not a reason to stay in something dangerous," Denise said. "I know." "Fatima, I know." She closed her eyes. I needed to hear your voice." "I'm here," Denise said. "Same as always." Another pause. "You want me to come?" "I can come. I'll tell my boss I have a family emergency, which is not even a lie." "Not yet," Fatima said. "Not yet." She ended the call and stood at the window until the light changed. Min-jae came home early that evening, 4 in the afternoon, which had not happened once in the 4 weeks she'd been here. He came in without the jacket, which was also unusual, his shirt untucked, a quality of barely managed containment in the way he moved that she clocked from across the room. He looked at her and stopped. "Tae-hyun is coming to Seoul," he said. She set down the book she'd been reading. "When?" "End of the week. And you're telling me this because there will be a dinner, a formal one. You'll be expected to attend." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the chair across from her. Not all the way back, perched on the edge the way someone sits when they're not planning to stay. "I need you to understand what that means before you're in it." "Explain it to me." He looked at his hands for a moment. The posture was unfamiliar on him. She'd cataloged his postures by now, the different architectures of how he occupied space, and this one was new, something almost exhausted in it, almost young. "Tae-hyun believes the marriage is a performance," Min-jae said. "He's going to try to prove that in the dinner. He'll ask you questions designed to expose gaps in what you know about me. He'll be courteous. He'll be completely legible as a threat to anyone paying attention and completely deniable to anyone who's not." "So what do I know about you?" Min-jae looked up. "Tell me," she said. "If I'm going to sit across from your cousin and convince him the marriage is real, I need to know actual things, not the surface-level things Tae-hyun already knows. Real things." He was quiet for a long moment. "My mother died when I was 11, he said. "My father ran the organization before me. He was not a good man, and I spent the first 20 years of my life trying to become something different from him, and the next 10 years understanding that it wasn't possible." He said this with no particular emotion, the way you state a fact you've made your peace with. "I don't sleep more than 4 hours. I've tried. I've had the same nightmare for 15 years, and I've stopped expecting it to stop." He paused. "I make very good coffee, and I can't cook anything except ramen, and I've eaten it approximately 400 times. I kept a dog for 3 years and he died, and I haven't had anything living in this apartment since." She looked at him. "My grandfather is the only person I've allowed to matter to me for a long time," he said, "and he's dying." He said this last part differently. The tone the same, but something underneath it not the same, something that had weight. "Which is why the marriage exists. Which is something you also have the right to know." She sat with this for a moment. "What's wrong with him?" "His heart. He has months. maybe less. The room was very quiet. The dinner, she said. I'll handle the dinner. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly. Something before gratitude. Something rawer than that. The look of a man who has not been surprised in a long time being surprised. You should know, he said carefully, that Taehyun is not the only concern. There are others inside the organization who question the marriage, who question you specifically, who feel that a contract wife from America, someone outside the structure, represents a vulnerability. Am I in danger? You're protected. That's different. No, it isn't. He held her gaze. You're right, he said. It isn't. He stood up. I'll tell you more after the dinner. All of it. Whatever you ask. He walked toward his study and stopped at the doorway. The thing my cousin doesn't understand, he said, to the doorframe, not turning around, is that the marriage being strategic doesn't make it untrue. Then he went into the study and closed the door, and she sat in the chair with his words rearranging the room, rearranging something larger than the room, and outside the soul sky was doing the thing it did at this hour, going from gray to a color that wasn't quite dark yet, the city's light beginning to compete with whatever natural light remained. The dinner was on a Friday. Taehyun was 40 minutes late, which she understood immediately was intentional. He walked in the way men walk when they've calculated their entrance. Not hurried, not apologetic, moving through the restaurant's private room with the contained energy of someone who expected to be watched and was comfortable with that expectation. He was handsome. She hadn't expected that, or hadn't expected it to be the specific kind of handsome he was. A little too polished, a little too assembled, the kind of face that had been looked at often enough to become aware of itself. He looked at her the way she'd anticipated, the slow assessment dressed up as a smile. So, he said, sitting down. The wife. He said it in English, which told her he'd done his research. So, she said. The cousin. Something moved in his eyes. Quick, amused, recalibrating. He reached for the water glass. Min-jae said you were direct. Min-jae doesn't talk about me to you, she said. So let's not start there. Across the table, Min-jae was still. Completely, unnervingly still. In the way she'd come to recognize as the opposite of calm. Not relaxation, but the tension of a wire pulled to its limit and held. Taehyun smiled. It was a very good smile. I heard you're from Baltimore. I am. Long way to come for a marriage. Love doesn't ask for flight times. The smile again. No, he agreed. It doesn't. He looked at Min-jae. She's good. She's not performing, Min-jae said. Taehyun picked up the menu, glanced at it, set it back down. Tell me something about him, he said to Fatima. Casual, conversational, a dagger wrapped in linen. Something I wouldn't know. She didn't look at Min-jae. She'd decided before she arrived that she would not look at Min-jae for help during this dinner. Either she could do this or she couldn't. He can't sleep, she said. 4 hours most nights. He eats ramyeon when he thinks no one's paying attention. He stood outside my son's door for 30 seconds the night after the museum because he wanted to check that Zion was okay and didn't know how to do it without making it a thing. She looked at Taehyun steadily. He keeps the coffee cups on the counter now. He used to rinse them immediately. He stopped doing that about 2 weeks ago. She picked up her water glass. Should I go on? Taehyun was looking at her with the smile still on his face, but something different behind it now. Something colder. Something that confirmed every assessment she'd made since he walked in. No, he said quietly. I think I understand. The rest of the dinner was a performance of pleasantry so precise it made her jaw ache from the effort of sustaining it. Taehyun was charming and implacable and present in every second like a stone in a shoe. You could walk, you could function, but the awareness of it was continuous. When he stood to leave, he shook Min-jae's hand with both of his, a gesture that looked warm from a distance and felt like a challenge from where she was sitting. He nodded at Fatima. Baltimore, he said. Seoul, she said back. He left. The room exhaled. Min-jae looked at her across the table. His expression had the quality of someone standing in the aftermath of something they'd been preparing for and discovering the preparation had been worth it. You didn't look at me once, he said. I didn't need to. He was quiet for a moment. What you said, about the door, about the cups, it was all true. I know. He looked at the table. That's what, he stopped. That's what I meant, about the marriage being real. She looked at him. The restaurant room was settling around them, the staff moving at a distance, the city indifferent behind the glass. Min Jae, she said, after the dinner, you said you'd tell me everything. All of it. Yes. Tomorrow. He met her eyes. Tomorrow, he said. She believed him. That was the problem. She kept believing him, and she had believed him about tomorrow. And tomorrow came and went, and then 4 more tomorrows came and went, because the week after the dinner, something inside the organization broke open, and Min Jae disappeared into it for 6 days, present in the apartment for 3 or 4 hours at a time, sleeping less than his usual impossible amount. The controlled surface of him wound so tight she could feel the vibration of it from across a room. She didn't push. She watched. She managed Zion's questions about why Min Jae looked tired, managed her own questions about the men who cycled through the lobby downstairs with increasing frequency, managed the small particular dread of a situation developing in a direction she could feel but not see. And then on the 7th day after the dinner, she couldn't sleep. 2 in the morning, soul completely dark outside the floor-to-ceiling glass. And she walked to the kitchen for water, and she was passing the secondary meeting room, and the door was open 6 inches, and the voices inside were not quiet. 2 voices, Min Jae and someone else, a voice she didn't recognize, deep and careful and very deliberate, speaking Korean too fast for her to follow. She stopped before the doorway. She pressed herself against the wall beside it, not in the doorway, against the wall, and she breathed through her mouth so the sound of it wouldn't give her away. She caught fragments. Her name again. She heard her name and the word for child and the word for risk. She heard what she now knew was Min Jae's name for the organization, a word she'd heard twice before and looked up, a word that meant exactly what she feared it meant. And then she heard something that stopped all of it. She heard Min Jae say, in English, clearly, switching languages in the way she'd noticed he sometimes did when he wanted to be absolutely precise. She doesn't know what I am. The other voice responded in Korean, Min Jae, and she isn't going to, not yet. Another exchange she couldn't follow. Min Jae still in English, quiet now, quieter than she'd ever heard him. She stays out of it. Whatever it costs, she and the boy stay out of it. Do you understand me? She stood against that wall for a long moment after the voices dropped back into Korean and she could no longer parse the words. She stood there and she understood something, finally, with the specific clarity of a thing you've been not understanding on purpose, because understanding it changes the shape of everything. She was married to the head of a criminal organization. She'd known it and not known it. She'd felt the edges of it and declined to press them. She'd accepted his non-answers and his half-answers and his, I'll tell you tomorrow. Because she understood now standing in this hallway at 2 in the morning, protecting herself from the information the same way you avoid pressing a bruise. Not because the bruise isn't there, but because pressing it makes it real in a way that requires a response. She walked back to her room. She lay down on the bed. She looked at the ceiling in the dark, and she listened to the city outside making its low, continuous sound, indifferent to the specific scale of her particular reckoning. She thought about Baltimore. She thought about the apartment on Greenmount and the buzzing lights at Kwan's Asian Market and the electric bill face down behind the fruit bowl. She thought about the card he'd handed her, plain white, just a number, and the specific quality of the choice she'd made when she dialed it. She thought about Zion's hand reaching for Min Jae's in the museum. She lay there for a long time, and then, sometime before dawn, she made a decision. Not to leave, not to stay, exactly. Not in the passive way that staying had been happening up to now. Something different. Something with its eyes open. Tomorrow she was going to ask him. Not wait for his tomorrow. Her tomorrow. And whatever he told her, so all of it, the shape of the whole thing, the organization, and the violence and the enemies and everything he'd been protecting her from knowing, she was going to hear it, because she was done being managed. That was the sentence she'd been building toward all night. The one that had been assembling itself in the dark while the city ran its light against the windows and her son slept in the next room, and somewhere on the other side of the apartment, Kang Min-jae sat with the weight of everything he hadn't told her pressing against the inside of his chest like water behind a dam. She got up at 6, showered, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with both hands around the mug and waited. He came in at 6:40, already dressed, already assembled into the version of himself he put on every morning like a second skin. He saw her at the table and stopped in the doorway. That half-second calibration, the one she'd cataloged, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting for a specific arrival and can see it coming from a distance. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was flat and gray through the windows, the kind of light that didn't soften anything. "I heard you last night," she said. "The meeting room. 2 in the morning." He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "How much?" "Enough." She set the mug down. "You said she doesn't know what I am. You said she isn't going to, not yet." She kept her voice even, which cost her something. "I'm done with not yet, Min-jae. I'm done with it today." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, at his hands, at some point between them that wasn't anything. Then he looked up at her. "What do you want to know first?" he said. "Everything. Start at the beginning and don't stop until it's all out." He took a breath. Long and slow, the kind that's not about oxygen. "My family has run a criminal organization in Seoul for 60 years, he said. "My grandfather built it. My father expanded it. When my father died, I inherited it at 26 whether I wanted it or not, and I didn't want it, which turned out to be irrelevant." He said this the way he said most true things, flat, direct, with no decoration. "We control significant portions of construction contracts, import logistics, private security operations, and certain financial channels that don't exist on paper. We have relationships with officials, law enforcement, politicians. We have enemies inside and outside the structure. The organization is called Chongya." Ishambachas. He paused. "Do you know what that means?" "No." "Blue night," he said. "My grandfather's choice. He said it was because the most dangerous things happen after dark when the sky is clear and you can see everything coming and still can't stop it." Another pause. "I've always thought it was an honest name." She absorbed this. "How many people?" "In the full structure, several hundred. Directly under me, 23. "Have you killed people?" The question landed clean and hard in the morning air. He looked at her without blinking. "Yes." She'd known the answer before she asked. Knowing it and hearing it were different countries. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm under the table and breathed through it. "How many?" 4. Directly. A beat. "More, by consequence of decisions I made." "Tell me about the consequence ones." "Fatima, tell me." He held her gaze for a moment. 3 years ago, there was a conflict with a rival faction. I made a call to consolidate a particular operation. 2 of their people died in the consolidation. They weren't combatants, exactly. They were peripheral. They died because of the decision I made and because of what that decision set in motion. He said it without self-pity and without self-absolution, which was somehow worse than either. "I think about them." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Seoul was starting its morning. She could hear the city's low, distant frequency beginning to build. "The marriage," she said. "Tell me the real reason." Something moved in his face. "My grandfather's condition," he said. "I told you that part. His heart. He had, before I married you, been pushing me for 2 years to marry. Not for appearances. He's never cared about appearances." He stopped. "He told me once that I was becoming something he didn't build Chongya for, that I was becoming someone who had nothing left worth protecting. That a man with nothing to protect becomes a man who makes decisions based on nothing except power, and power without something underneath it becomes cruelty eventually." He was choosing his words with a care she could feel. "He gave me the ultimatum not to secure the succession. That was part of it, yes, but the real reason—" He stopped again. "He said he was afraid of who I was going to be in 10 years if nothing changed." She sat with this. "He chose you," Min-jae said. "I want you to know that. He had you found. He'd been looking for a year with Shaes, not a Korean woman from inside the structure, because anyone from inside the structure would understand the game and play it. He wanted someone from outside, someone who couldn't be bought by the context because they didn't know the context. He paused. Someone with something real already built, someone with a child. The cold moved through her slowly, from the center outward. Your grandfather chose me, she said. Yes. And you went to the store knowing I'd be there. Yes. She looked at him. The photograph on my phone case. I'd seen your photograph before the store. I already knew what you looked like. I knew your name. I knew about Zion. The grocery store was the first opportunity to make contact in a setting that wasn't, he stopped, in a setting where you would have some control over whether to engage. She stood up. She didn't knock the chair back. She was careful, specifically careful, because the thing moving through her was large enough that she needed to manage it or it would manage her. She walked to the window. She put her hand against the glass. The cold of it traveled up her palm. You staged it, she said. Yes. The whole thing, the aisle, the card, the restaurant. The restaurant was your choice. The grocery store was yours. She turned around. I thought I made a reckless decision. I thought I saw something and I took a chance. I thought it was mine. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. That's not what it was. He stood up too. He didn't come toward her. He read the distance she needed and he stayed on his side of it, which was the right call, and also the thing that made it worse because it meant he understood exactly what he'd done. Everything I told you in the restaurant was true, he said. Every term of the contract. Everything I promised about Zion. None of that was manipulation. It was all manipulation, she said. A true thing can still be manipulation if the context around it is a lie. He had nothing to say to that. He looked at her, and he had nothing, and she watched him not have it, and that was its own particular thing. Seeing a man who had an answer for everything arrive at a place where he didn't. I'm not leaving, she said. He looked up. I'm not leaving today. She pressed her hand harder against the glass. But I need you to understand that you took something from me. You took the choice. You gave me a version of a choice, but you built the walls before I got there and called it freedom. She looked at him directly. That is something you need to sit with. Yes, he said. I know. Don't agree with me to make it easier. I'm not. He said it quietly. I'm agreeing because you're right. She looked at the river, flat silver in the morning gray. I need a day, she said. Today. Don't talk to me today. He nodded. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the kitchen doorway, he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his back to her. Fatima, he said. She didn't answer. I'm sorry, he said. That's not enough. I know it isn't, but I wanted to say it before. He stopped. Before the day. He left. She stood at the window for a long time after she heard the front door close. The city moved below her, ordinary and enormous. She pressed her forehead against the glass, and she felt its cold, and she breathed through the thing in her chest that was several things at once, fury and grief, and something else she was not going to name today, something she was going to set in a box and put on a high shelf and not touch for 24 hours. She heard Zion's door open down the hall, his footsteps, the sound of him stopping in the kitchen doorway. Mom? Where's Min Jae? She lifted her head from the glass. She turned around. She put her face in the right arrangement. Early meeting, she said. Hungry? He padded to the counter in his socks, climbed onto the stool, reached for the cereal. Is everything okay? She looked at her son, 8 years old, gap-toothed, Orioles cap on despite not having been outside yet, the person she had brought across the world on the word of a stranger who had turned out to be something more and less and more complicated than a stranger. Yes, she said. Everything's okay. She went to make him breakfast. The day was the hardest kind, the kind where nothing externally breaks, where the surface holds, where you manage every hour and the hour after that, and the thing you're managing never gets smaller just because you're managing it. She took Zion to the language center he'd started attending 3 weeks ago, walked back through the neighborhood in the cold air, stopped at a small cafe she'd found in her second week that made coffee the way she liked it without her having to explain. She sat there for an hour with her phone face down and let herself feel the full dimension of what she'd learned. He had been chosen. She had been found. Some old man in a dying body had looked at her photograph, at her, at Zion, at the specific shape of her life, and decided she was the missing piece his grandson needed, and had engineered an encounter in a rice aisle in Baltimore to deliver her to a conclusion that had been made before she ever walked through the door. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. And the question that arrived, which she had not expected, which she was not ready for, did the engineering make any of it untrue? The way he listened to Zion, the way he stood outside her son's door, the way his face had done that thing in the museum, that brief, unguarded thing when Zion took his hand, the coffee cup on the counter, the fact that he'd told her the truth this morning when the easier thing, significantly easier, she understood his situation well enough now to know, would have been to continue the careful managed non-answers indefinitely. She pressed her thumb into the cafe table and did not answer the question. She picked up Zion. She made dinner. She moved through the apartment's evening rhythms with the mechanical competence of a woman who has performed normalcy under pressure so many times that it had become its own kind of muscle memory. Min Jae came home at 8. He went to his study. He didn't come out. She respected that. At 10:30, she knocked on his study door. He opened it. He'd taken off the jacket, rolled his sleeves, the working posture, the one she'd come to recognize. His expression was the careful, contained one, but underneath it she could see the day he'd had, the weight of it in the lines around his eyes. "I'm not done being angry," she said. "Okay. But I have questions, and I'd rather have answers than sit with nothing." He stepped back from the door. She came in. The study was large, lined with shelves that held documents and a few books, and almost nothing personal. One exception, on the corner of the desk, a photograph in a small frame. Old man, severe face, eyes that held the same quality she recognized in Min Jae, that specific quality of a person who sees what other people are looking away from. She picked it up. "Your grandfather," she said. "Yes." "Does he know about me? The real me? That I didn't just walk into this?" "He knows everything." She set the photograph back down. "I want to meet him." Min Jae looked at her. "Why?" "Because he decided I was a solution to something without asking me, and I want to look him in the face." A pause. "He's in Busan. He's not well enough to travel." "Then we go to Busan." Min Jae studied her. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm not afraid of old men in photographs." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the posture of someone who intended to stay for a while. "Tell me about Tae Hyun, the real version." He sat behind the desk, folded his hands. "Tae Hyun is my father's brother's son, a year older than me. When my father died, the succession should have, in Tae Hyun's reading of the structure, gone to him. I was younger. My father and his father had been in conflict for years over the direction of Cheongya. When the grandfather chose me instead, Tae Hyun accepted it publicly and has been building toward reversing it privately for 9 years. Building how? Accumulating loyalty within the structure, aligning with external interests, waiting for a viable moment." He paused. "The marriage gave him a viable argument, that I was compromised, that I'd introduced an unknown variable into the center of the organization. Me. You." She absorbed this. "What does he want to do about it?" Min Jae held her gaze. "Tae Hyun's position is that the marriage should be dissolved, that you and Zion should be returned to America with the financial terms honored, and—" He stopped. Something in how he stopped made her go still. "And what?" she said. "And that Cheongya should be restructured with Tae Hyun in a significantly elevated position, in exchange for his agreement not to pursue the challenge formally within the council." Council. The governing structure. 12 senior members. They can call a leadership review if a sufficient number request it. He paused. Tae Hyun has 6. "How many do you need for a review?" 7. The room was very quiet. "So he's 1 vote away from being able to formally challenge your leadership," she said. "Yes." "And dissolving the marriage, getting rid of me, is part of what he's offering to the council members he's trying to flip." "It's one part. She looked at the desk, at the photograph, at Minjae's hands, folded, very still. Is there a seventh vote he can get? The pause before he answered told her the answer before he gave it. Potentially, he said, one member who has been uncertain, senior. His name is Director Park. He doesn't want conflict. He doesn't want disruption. If Taehyun can convince him that removing you solves the disruption without a larger confrontation, then Park gives him the seventh vote. Yes. And then what? They vote you out? A leadership review creates a formal challenge period, during which Taehyun's support within the organization becomes overt. Actions become possible that are not possible now. He said this carefully, choosing the shape of each word. During a formal challenge period, the constraints that currently protect certain people, certain arrangements, become provisional. She understood what he was not saying. She'd grown up in Baltimore. She knew how to read the language of a threat that wasn't stating itself directly. He'd come for us, she said, during the challenge period, not formally, but he'd come for us. Min-jae looked at her. I will not allow that. That's not an answer to the question. No, he said, it isn't. He unclenched his hands, resettled them. If Taehyun gets the seventh vote, there is a window, 10 days of formal deliberation, during which the protections I've built around you and Zion become dependent on my ability to move quickly enough to close the window before something happens inside it. He paused. I intend to close it. How? He looked at her steadily. That's the part you're better protected by not. Min-jae. She said it quietly, but with a weight that stopped him. If you say those words to me right now, I will get up and pack and be on a flight by morning. I'm not asking for your protection. I'm asking for information about the situation I'm inside. He held her gaze for a long time, a long measured time, during which she watched him make the decision. She understood now he'd been avoiding since the day they met. I need to get to Director Park before Taehyun does, he said. There are things about Park's history that Taehyun doesn't know I know. If I use them correctly, Park doesn't give the seventh vote. The challenge period never opens. Taehyun's position collapses without the formal mechanism to make it viable. Fools. He paused. But if Park has already committed to Taehyun before I reach him, if Taehyun is further along than my intelligence suggests, then the situation changes significantly and quickly. How significantly? He looked at her with the expression of a man who had finally stopped deciding how much to give and was giving all of it. Significantly enough that I would need to move you and Zion immediately. Tonight, if necessary. The word tonight landed in the room like a stone in water, the ripples expanding outward. She looked at the photograph of the old man in the frame. She looked at Min-jae. She thought about 6 weeks. The particular compressed life of the past 6 weeks. All of it. The airport and the penthouse and the dinner and the museum and every conversation in this kitchen at the hours when the city was quiet and it was just the two of them and the specific unguarded thing she'd seen in him in increments, the real thing underneath the legend. When do you need to talk to Park? She said. Tomorrow. Then we sleep tonight, she said, and you talk to Park tomorrow, and then we know what we're dealing with. She stood up. And Min-jae? He looked up at her. If it goes wrong tomorrow, she said, you tell me immediately. Not after you've decided what I can handle. Not after you've had time to manage the information. Immediately. Do you understand? Yes, he said. She started toward the door. Fatima. She stopped. I chose you too, he said. She turned halfway. He was looking at the desk, not at her, the way he sometimes said the truest things, sideways, as if looking directly at them made them harder to get out. Not the way he did, not from a photograph, but after. In the restaurant, when you looked at me like you were deciding whether I was worth the risk. He paused. I chose you too. She stood in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She went to her room and lay down in the dark and put her arm over her eyes and lay there until the city outside went from its late-night frequency to its earliest morning one, that specific hour when Seoul was quieter than it would be again until the same hour the following day. She thought about choice, the architecture of it, the difference between a choice made freely and a choice made inside a frame someone else built. And whether that difference was absolute or whether there was a version of it, a complicated, uncomfortable, specific version where both things could be true at once. She thought about what he'd said. I chose you too. She thought about Zion asleep in the next room. Zion, who had brought his dinosaur books to a man's study without being asked and left them there like a small claiming of territory. She was still thinking when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize. Korean characters she had to read slowly, working through her 3 weeks of vocabulary, sounding out the shapes. She read it twice. Then she sat up in bed with her heart doing something loud and asymmetrical in her chest, because the message was not from Min Jae, and it was not from anyone in the household. And it was short, 4 lines, and what it said, the message said, your husband is going to meet Park tonight. Taehyun already has him. If Min Jae walks into that meeting, he doesn't walk out. Take your son and go to the address below. You have 2 hours. An address in Seoul she didn't recognize. No name, no signature. She sat in the dark with the phone in both hands, and her heart hitting the inside of her ribs with the specific violence of a body that understood danger before the mind had finished processing the words. 2 hours. She read it a 3rd time. The Korean was simple, chosen for someone still learning. Someone had known her level, had calibrated the message for her, which meant whoever sent this had been watching more closely than she'd understood. She got up. She went to Min Jae's study without knocking. He was still there, at the desk, still in the working posture, and he looked up when the door opened with an expression that shifted immediately when he saw her face. She held the phone out across the desk. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the controlled surface of him absorb each line with the flat, rapid attention of a man processing threat assessments, and then she watched something happen underneath that surface that she'd never seen there before. A tightening, a specific, unguarded quality of alarm. He reached for his own phone, dialed. The call connected on the first ring, and he was speaking before the other person could start. Korean, rapid, the wall-building cadence from before, but faster now, harder. And she stood in the doorway and watched him, and the cold in her chest was not panic. She was specific about that. She had been panicked before. She knew the shape of it, the way it hollowed you out and made your hands stupid. This was not that. This was the opposite. A compressing, a tightening inward, everything non-essential burning off like vapor. He ended the call. He looked at her. Who has your number? He said. Nobody here. It's my American number. Your Korean number. I don't have a Korean number. He turned the phone over in his hand, looked at the message again. Someone with access to your American contact information sent this. He looked up. Did you give this number to anyone here? No one except Denise. And Ji Young, for household... She stopped. Ji Young has it. He was already dialing again. She heard Ji Young's voice answer, heard the exchange. Brief, 2 sentences from him. One from her, a pause, another from her. And then he ended the call. Ji Young received a call this afternoon asking to confirm a household contact number for an insurance registry, he said. She didn't think... He stopped. She gave the number. So someone in Taehyun's reach got to Ji Young. Not threatening her, just information gathering. She had no reason to... He stood up. It doesn't matter. The question is whether the message is true. Is it true? Is Taehyun already at Park? He didn't answer immediately, which was the answer. He walked past her into the hallway and she followed him because standing still was no longer a viable option. He made 2 more calls in rapid succession, moving through the main room, and on the second call she heard something change in the other person's voice, even through the language barrier. A pitch, a compression. And Min Jae stopped walking. He stood in the center of the main room with his back to her, and he listened to whatever was being said, and she watched the set of his shoulders, and she understood what she was watching. He ended the call. Taehyun met with Park at 7 this evening, he said. He didn't turn around immediately. Before I knew, before I could... He stopped. Park has confirmed the 7th vote. The room didn't move. The city outside the glass moved, indifferent and continuous, but the room held still around those words. The challenge period, she said, starts at midnight. He turned around. His face was the controlled one, the contained one. But the quality of the control was different now. Not the habitual management of a man organizing his expression for daily use, but the specific applied force of a man holding something very large in place by will alone. I have 4 hours. To do what? To make a move before the challenge period opens and the formal structure locks in. Once it's official, once the council is formally notified, my options inside the structure become limited in ways that are, he paused, significant. What kind of move? I need to get to Taehyun directly. She looked at him. You mean a confrontation? I mean a conversation. A final one. His jaw tightened. Taehyun wants the organization. He doesn't want a war inside it. A war is expensive. It costs everyone. It creates vulnerabilities to external interference. If I can offer him something that costs me but satisfies the core of what he's building toward, he withdraws the challenge before midnight. The vote disappears. Park 7th means nothing without the formal filing. What can you offer him that satisfies a 9-year ambition? Min-jae looked at her steadily. A restructuring. Formal elevation of his role. Operational control of 3 divisions he's been positioning toward for years. A guaranteed succession pathway. He paused. Essentially, everything except my actual seat. And he accepts that? I don't know. He said it with the particular honesty she'd come to recognize, the kind that didn't package itself. Taehyun is ambitious, but he's not irrational. An elevated position without conflict is worth more in practical terms than a contested leadership that costs both sides. If I can make that argument before midnight, where is he? He was already moving toward the room where she knew the household security kept an overnight presence. She followed. Min-jae, where is he? A private club in Gangnam. He uses it for meetings. He pushed open the door. One of the security detail, the one called Byun, the one with the scar across his left forearm that she'd stopped pretending not to notice, stood up immediately. Min-jae spoke to him in Korean, rapid and flat, and Byun's expression shifted into the focused, operational mode of a man receiving orders. I'm coming, Fatima said. Min-jae turned to look at her. No. The message was sent to me. Whoever sent it wanted me in motion. They wanted me out of this apartment, or they wanted me to tip you off, or both. Either way, I'm already inside whatever is happening tonight, and sitting here while you walk into, you're not coming. Then explain to me why I should trust you'll walk back through that door. She said it quietly, without heat, which made it land harder than heat would have. You said immediately. If it goes wrong, immediately. It went wrong. I'm here. I'm asking. He looked at her for a moment. The controlled face. The held door. Zion stays here, he said, with Bayun and 2 others. They do not open this door for anyone except me or you. You understand? Yes. And you stay in the car. Unless you don't come back out. He held her gaze. Whatever he was calculating, he calculated it fast. Unless I don't come back out, he said. The car moved through Seoul at 11:15 with the city's nighttime frequency running past the windows. The restaurant strips and the lit towers and the specific human density of a major city at an hour that belonged to the people who did their living after dark. She sat in the back seat, and Min-jae sat beside her, and Byun drove, and they didn't speak for most of the 20-minute ride, which was the kind of silence that had nothing to do with having nothing to say. At one point, Min-jae's hand moved on the seat between them. Not toward her, not a gesture of reassurance, just a movement, his fingers pressing flat against the leather and releasing. She watched it happen. She looked out her window. If this doesn't work, she said to the glass, if Taehyun doesn't withdraw, then we move quickly before midnight, and I'm not asking about the strategy. She turned to look at him. I'm asking if you're afraid. He held her gaze in the moving dark of the back seat, the city's light crossing his face at intervals as they passed beneath street lamps. Yes, he said. Of losing the organization? A pause. Of losing what's in the apartment right now, he said. Zion with Byun trying to explain security protocol to a child who's going to ask him questions about armor for the next 20 minutes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, close to one. That. She looked at him for a long moment. The car turned. Don't do anything that gets you killed, she said. That's my intention. I mean it. I know. He looked at her directly. I know you mean it. The club was discreet in the specific way that expensive things are discreet. No sign, a door set into a building face that looked like nothing, a man outside who recognized Min Jae's approach and made a call before they reached the door. Inside, low light, the smell of wood and whiskey and climate control, the kind of place where the sound didn't travel room to room. She stayed in the car. Byun stayed with her. Min Jae went in with one man she'd seen before, not household security, someone else, someone with the specific quality of the men who stood in lobbies and watched without appearing to watch. Byun sat in the front seat and said nothing. She sat in the back and watched the door. 11:28, 11:40, 11:51. The door opened, but it was not Min Jae who came out first. It was two men she didn't recognize, jackets, the hands visible, posture. And they came out fast, and behind them came Tae-hyun, and behind Tae-hyun came Min Jae, and even from 30 feet away in the dark of the back seat, she could read the scene. It was not resolved. Whatever had happened in there was not the resolution Min Jae had gone in for, and the specific quality of Tae-hyun's walk, unhurried, precise, carrying the satisfied stillness of a man who has just gotten what he needed, made the cold in her chest press outward. They spoke on the pavement. She couldn't hear. She could see. Min Jae's posture was contained, completely controlled, nothing readable from this distance except the set of his jaw, which she'd learned by now like a language. Tae-hyun spoke, looked at his phone, said something else. Then he looked at the car. He looked directly at the car, directly at her window, and he could not have seen her through the tinted glass, but the precision of his gaze, the exact angle of it, aimed at exactly where she was sitting, told her someone had told him she was there. He smiled at the window. Then he walked away. Min Jae stood on the pavement and watched him go. From behind, from 30 feet, in the dark, she watched the stillness of him, and she felt the night crystallize around that moment into something irreversible. He got in the car. "It's done," he said to Byun. Byun started driving. "Talk to me," she said. Tae-hyun filed at 11:40. His voice was level and hollow simultaneously, the specific tone of controlled devastation. He had someone remote file the formal challenge notice before the meeting started, before I walked in. He looked forward through the windshield. The meeting was theater. He was never going to withdraw. He wanted me there to make an offer that he could use as evidence of a weakened position, of a man trying to negotiate from a losing hand. He recorded it, almost certainly. So the challenge period is open. Yes. And he has the 7 votes. Yes. She breathed, slow, deliberate, in through the nose. What do you need to do in the next, she looked at her phone, in the next 6 minutes before midnight? There's nothing I can do in 6 minutes that changes the formal structure. He was quiet for a moment. What I can do, starting at midnight, is operate outside the formal structure. She looked at him. What does that mean? It means that the council has procedure, and Tae-hyun has positioned himself perfectly within that procedure. What Tae-hyun doesn't have is every piece of the organization. There are people who are mine, not formally, not on paper, but mine, who don't move for Tae-hyun regardless of what the council vote looks like. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes in the dark had that quality she'd seen only a few times before, the quality she understood now as what lay underneath the controlled surface, when the surface stopped being sufficient. 10 days. I have 10 days of the deliberation period to demonstrate to the council that the challenge is not in their interest, that keeping me is worth more than the disruption costs. By doing what? By making Tae-hyun's position untenable. How? He looked at her for a moment longer. Outside, Seoul ran past them, and somewhere in the apartment Zion was asking Byun questions about armor, and the phone in her hand read 11:58. There's a man, Min Jae said, a council member. His name is Director Lim. He's been Tae-hyun's longest alliance. They've been aligned for 6 years. If Lim moves away from Tae-hyun, 2 others follow him because they follow Lim. That drops Tae-hyun from 7 votes to 4. And how do you move Lim? Lim has a problem he's been managing privately for 3 years. A financial situation with certain external parties that Tae-hyun does not know I know about. He paused. But there's a complication. Tell me. The information about Lim came from one source inside the structure. One person I trust completely who has been positioned near Lim's operations for 2 years, feeding me information. He stopped. Something in how he stopped. That person, she said slowly, is the person who sent me the message tonight. He was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Her name is Ha-eun, he said. She has been inside Tae-hyun's peripheral network for 2 years feeding me information. She sent you the warning because she couldn't reach me. Tae-hyun had my direct line monitored this evening. She couldn't risk contact. He paused. She also told me tonight that Tae-hyun knows about her. The car went quiet in a specific way. He knows she's been feeding you information, Fatima said. Yes. For how long has he known? She doesn't know. She found out tonight through a second-tier contact that she'd been flagged. He looked at his hands. If Tae-hyun knows about Ha-eun, then everything she's given me, Lim's financial situation, the external parties, all of it, Tae-hyun knows I have it, and he's had time to build a counter. Meaning the leverage is compromised. Meaning Lim has been warned. Meaning when I go to Lim with what I know, Lim is already prepared for that conversation. And a man who is prepared for your leverage is a man who has already decided your leverage isn't sufficient. His voice was level, completely flat, and she understood now that the flatness was not coldness. It was what happened to his voice when the thing he was feeling was too large to inflect. I'm 3 moves behind, he said. I've been 3 moves behind since before the meeting tonight. 12:01. The challenge period was open. The car pulled into the building's underground entrance, and Byun cut the engine, and the 3 of them sat in the enclosed silence of the garage with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and Seoul sealed away above them. Ha-eun, Fatima said. Is she safe? She's moving. She has protocols. A pause. She'll be all right. And Lim. I'll go to Lim tomorrow, even knowing he's been prepared, because the alternative is not going to Lim. He opened the car door. Sometimes you make a move that probably won't work because the only other option is not making the move. She got out. They stood in the garage, the fluorescent light buzzing between them. Min Jai. She looked at him across the roof of the car. You said you're 3 moves behind. Yes. Then stop trying to catch up on Taehyun's board. She held his gaze. He built this game. He built the rules of it, and the timeline and the structure you're now trying to operate inside. You're never going to catch up playing the game he made. He looked at her. You need a different board, she said. He was very still. What are you suggesting? I don't know your world well enough to tell you what exactly, but I know this. She put her hand flat on the cold roof of the car. Tae-hyun has been playing this for 9 years. Patient and careful, and building inside the structure because the structure is where the power lives. You've been operating the same way because that's the world you know. She held his gaze. What's outside the structure? What's the thing he's never had to account for because it's never been a factor? He looked at her for a long moment. Then something moved in his face. Something she hadn't seen before. A specific quality of attention, different from the operational focus she'd watched all night. Something that looked almost like... His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The expression changed. It's my grandfather, he said. She watched him answer it, watched him listen, watched the quality of his stillness shift as the voice on the other end spoke, shift and shift again. The door he kept held shut moving against his grip in a way she could see from 3 feet away. He lowered the phone. He wants to see us, he said. Both of us. Tomorrow. Busan. He looked at her with an expression that was several things simultaneously. Exhaustion and something raw underneath it, and something else she didn't have a framework for yet. He says he has something to tell me that he should have told me before the marriage. Before any of it. He paused. He says it changes what I think I'm fighting for. She stood in the garage under the buzzing light with the cold concrete smell and the weight of a day that had reorganized itself 3 times already. And she looked at the man she'd married in a courthouse 11 minutes and signed 4 documents and carried across an ocean into a life she hadn't chosen, who was standing across a car roof at 12:03 in the morning, looking at her with his grandfather's voice still in his ear and something broken open in his face. Then we go to Busan, she said. He nodded. He looked down at the phone in his hand. And then from the elevator across the garage, the doors opened and Byun stepped out. And behind him, in the Orioles cap he'd apparently not taken off despite being asleep, was Zion, rubbing one eye with his fist, the dinosaur book tucked under his arm. And he looked across the garage at both of them with the steady gravity of a child who had been waiting and had decided to stop waiting. "Is everything okay?" he said. Min-jae looked at him. Then he crossed the garage in 8 steps and crouched down, fully, completely, the way he always did. And he looked at Zion at eye level and said, with a steadiness in his voice that cost him something she could hear, "Not yet, but we're working on it." Zion looked at him, looked at his mother, looked back at Min-jae. "Okay," he said. He held up the dinosaur book. "I found the part about ankylosaur armor while Byun was explaining security stuff. I think you should read it." Min-jae looked at the book, the controlled face, the held door. And then something gave, not broke, gave, the specific yielding of something that has held as long as it can. And he took the book from Zion with both hands and said quietly, "Show me." And Zion took his hand and started talking. And Min-jae stood up and walked beside him toward the elevator, and Fatima stood at the car and watched them go, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the city lived and breathed above them. And somewhere in Busan, an old man with a failing heart was holding a secret that was going to change the shape of... The drive to Busan took 4 hours. They left at 6 in the morning with Zion asleep across the back seat, his head in Fatima's lap, the dinosaur book open across his chest where it had slid from his loosening hands sometime around the first hour. Min-jae drove. Byun followed in a second car at a distance that told her this was standard operating procedure and not something Min-jae had explained to her. She'd stopped needing things explained. She was learning to read the shape of his world the way you learn a language. Not word by word, but by immersion, by accumulation, by the slow process of patterns becoming legible. The highway unspooled south through the gray of early morning. She watched the light change over the hills, that particular Korean landscape she'd been studying for 2 months now, trying to make it familiar, trying to make it feel like something she belonged inside. Some mornings it almost worked. Min-jae hadn't slept. She could tell by the specific quality of his alertness. Too even, too maintained, the alertness of a man running on will rather than rest. He'd been on his phone until 2, then sitting in the kitchen when she came out at 3 for water, then at the window when she passed the main room at 4:30. He hadn't said anything. She hadn't asked. Somewhere past Daejeon, Zion shifted in her lap and said, without fully waking, "Are we there?" "Not yet," she said. "Sleep." He slept. She looked out the window and thought about the old man in the photograph, and the secret he'd been holding, and the 4 hours between now and the shape of the thing none of them fully understood yet. The house in Busan was not what she'd expected, which meant she'd been wrong again, which was becoming a pattern she'd have to address in herself eventually. She'd expected something that telegraphed power the way the Seoul penthouse did, scale and height, and the specific vocabulary of extreme wealth. What she found was a house on a hill above the water, old, not ostentatiously maintained, the kind of structure that had been built to last rather than to impress. The garden was overgrown in the specific way of a garden that had once been kept by someone who was no longer well enough to keep it. A nurse met them at the door. A doctor stood in the hallway. Chairman Kang Myung-soo was sitting up in a chair by the window when they came in. He was smaller than his photograph. That was the first thing. The photograph on Min-jae's desk had a quality of solidity to it, of mass, and the man in the chair by the window had the specific diminishment of serious illness, the way the body begins to return to something minimal when it is finished with accumulation. He had a blanket across his knees. His hands on the armrests were the most alive thing about him, the fingers moving slowly against the fabric in a rhythm that might have been unconscious. He looked at Fatima the way Min-jae sometimes looked at things. Not the way most people looked, not a social look, not a presented look, but the direct instrumental gaze of someone taking an accurate measurement. Then he looked at Zion, who was standing beside Fatima with his hands in his jacket pockets in the posture he assumed when he was in a new situation and processing it, and the old man's expression did something she hadn't expected. It softened, not sentimentally, not the performed softness of an adult encountering a child. Something real and involuntary, something that moved through his face like weather. "Sit down," he said, in English that was accented and careful, and clearly something he'd prepared. "All of you." Min-jae sat. The posture he had in this room was different from every other room she'd seen him in. Subtly different. A register of deference she'd never observed in him before. Something old and probably involuntary. He sat across from his grandfather like a man who had been 12 years old in this person's presence once, and some part of him had never entirely left that. The old man looked at her. "You're angry with my grandson," he said. She held his gaze. "I've been angrier. You are angry with me." "Yes." He nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "Good," he said. "That means you're paying attention." He shifted in the chair. A slow, careful movement, the kind where the body has to be negotiated with. "I want to tell you what I told Min-jae on the phone. And then I want to tell you what I never told him, which is more important." Min-jae was very still beside her. "I chose you," the old man said, looking at Fatima. "I want to be honest about that and not apologize for it, because I believe I was right to do it, and apologies for right actions are a waste of time." A pause. "But I want you to understand why. Not the version Min-jae told you, the succession, the ultimatum. That was the mechanism. It was not the reason." He looked at his grandson. "When Min-jae was 26 and he took over this organization," he said, still in that careful, prepared English, "I watched something happen to him that I had watched happen to his father before him. The work does it. Not immediately. Gradually. The decisions you make, one after another, all of them with real costs, all of them with blood on one side or the other. And you learn to make them faster and cleaner, and you tell yourself that getting faster and cleaner is getting better." He paused. "What you're actually doing is getting further from the part of yourself that knows the decisions cost anything at all." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the sea was visible between the hills, gray-green and flat in the morning light. "His father became that," the old man said, "all the way. A man who made decisions and felt nothing about them afterward. I watched it happen, and I did not stop it. And that is the thing I will take with me when I go." He looked at his hands. "When I saw it starting in Min-jae 5-6 years ago, it starts small. I made a decision. The organization could survive a leadership change. It had survived them before. What could not be repaired once it was complete was a man." Min-jae was looking at the floor. "The woman I was looking for," the old man said to Fatima, "was not a wife. She was someone outside. Someone who had built something real from nothing, who knew what things actually cost, who could not be absorbed into this world because she already had a world of her own." He paused. "Someone who would not become part of the organization, who would remain herself inside it. That is very rare. Most people, given what you have been given, would begin to become it. You haven't." She looked at him. "You couldn't have known that from a photograph." "No," he agreed. "I couldn't. That part was hope." He looked at her steadily. "I am an old man who did an arrogant and arguably wrong thing because I could not think of another way to save my grandson. I am asking you to decide for yourself whether the outcome changes the nature of the act." Fatima sat with that. She looked at the sea through the window. She thought about the rice aisle and the plain white card, and the choice that wasn't entirely a choice, and the 6 weeks of a life that had become, against her careful management of her own expectations, something she didn't want to lose. "What's the thing you never told him?" she said. The old man looked at Min-jae. Something passed between them. Not words, the older communication, the one that lives underneath words in people who have known each other across decades. "The organization," he said. "Cheongya. I want it to end." Min-jae looked up. "Not collapse. Not be taken. End." The old man's hands pressed against the armrests. "I built it 60 years ago because I was 23 years old and I was hungry and I was ruthless and I didn't have another way. That was true then. It has been less and less true for 20 years, and I have kept it anyway because I didn't know how to put down something I had been carrying that long." He looked at his grandson. "Tae-hyun can have what he wants. Let him take it." Not as a defeat, as a release. The legitimate holdings, the real assets, the things that don't require what Cheongya requires, those transfer to Min-jae, and they become the foundation of something clean, something you can build on without looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Min-jae's voice, when it came, was low and very flat. "You're telling me to walk away." "I'm telling you to walk away before the walking costs more than you have left." The old man looked at him with the directness of someone who has nothing left to protect. Tae-hyun gets Cheongya. He gets a challenge period that resolves in his favor. He gets what he spent 9 years building toward. And in 5 years, 7 years, the thing he worked his whole life for eats him the same way it ate your father, the same way it was going to eat you. He paused. You don't have to watch that happen. You don't have to be inside it when it does. The council members who are mine, Min-jae said, the people who've been loyal, will be protected. Tae-hyun is not interested in retribution. He's interested in control. A clean transition serves him. It will be structured to protect the people inside it. The old man shifted in his chair. This is what I should have said before the marriage. Before I handed you to each other across a rice aisle in Baltimore like pieces in a plan. He looked at Fatima. I'm sorry for the way it was done. I am not sorry that it was done. Fatima looked at the old man for a long moment. 8 years of single motherhood had given her a very specific ability to read exhaustion. The real kind, bone deep, the kind that has been carried long enough to become structural. She could see it in him. The exhaustion of a man who had been holding something for 60 years and had finally, in the reduced clarity of a failing body, understood what the holding had cost. Zion, she said. Zion, who had been sitting very still beside her with the dinosaur book in his lap, looked up. Why don't you go ask the nurse if there's somewhere you can read for a few minutes? He looked at the old man, then at Min-jae. With the steady gravity that was entirely his own, he stood up, and then he crossed the room to the old man's chair, and he held out the dinosaur book. You can look at this while we're talking, he said. The pictures are good, even if you can't read English. The old man looked down at the book in Zion's hands. The softening in his face happened again, that real involuntary thing. He took the book with both hands. Thank you, he said. Zion nodded and went to find the nurse. Proszę. They stayed in Busan for 2 days. The first day was the conversation, the full one, the one with all the pieces on the table, Min-jae and his grandfather and Fatima sitting in that room above the sea while the light changed outside, and the nurse brought tea that went cold on the table, and Byun stood somewhere outside the door, doing whatever Byun did in the spaces between. The conversation was not clean and it was not easy. And at one point Min-jae stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a long time with his back to the room. And the old man said nothing, and Fatima said nothing. And after a while Min-jae came back and sat down. The second day was quieter. In the morning Min-jae made calls. A different quality of call than the ones she'd been overhearing for 2 months. Not the tightly controlled operational frequency, but something that had a different register, slower, longer pauses, the sound of a man choosing words he'd never had to choose before. She didn't listen. She took Zion to the waterfront, and they walked along the harbor, and he found a cat sitting on a pier post and spent 20 minutes in solemn negotiation with it over whether it would allow itself to be touched, which it eventually did. And she stood there in the cold sea air watching her son make friends with a harbor cat in Busan. And she felt something move through her that she couldn't have named and didn't try to. In the afternoon, Min-jae found them at the harbor. He walked toward them with his hands in his pockets and his jacket open against the cold, and he looked different in some way she was still trying to locate. Not changed, not transformed in the dramatic way of stories, just shifted. A weight carried slightly differently. The way your posture changes when you've been holding a bag on one shoulder for so long, you forget you're holding it, and then you put it down. He stood beside her and looked at the water. It's done, he said. She looked at him. How? I called Tae-hyun this morning, told him I was withdrawing the contest. The challenge period runs its formal course. The council confirms the transition. Tae-hyun takes the formal seat within 30 days. He paused. The legitimate holdings, the construction interests, the shipping logistics, 3 properties, the investment accounts, transfer to a new structure under my name. Clean, legal, auditable. Another pause. It took 40 minutes. How did he respond? He was silent for a long time. Min-jae looked at the water. Then he said he wasn't certain I wasn't setting a trap. Are you? He turned to look at her. No. She studied his face. The sea light was doing something to it. Not flattering, just honest, the flat gray light that showed things as they were rather than as they might want to be seen. "Are you all right?" she said. He thought about this with genuine attention rather than the reflexive fine that men like him kept ready. "I don't know yet," he said. "I know it's right. I know the other version, fighting for it, spending the next 5 years holding on to something that was going to require an increasingly terrible price. I know that version ends somewhere I don't want to be." He paused. "Whether right makes it all right is a different question." "It doesn't," she said. "Not immediately." He looked at her. "It just means you made the right call," she said. "The rest is time." Zion had discovered a second cat further down the pier and was pursuing it with diplomatic patience. Min-jae watched him. "The year is almost up," he said. She went still. "The contract. 11 months. He kept his eyes on Zion. "I wanted to say something before it expired, and the thing I needed to say got tangled up with the logistics of it expiring." She waited. "I don't want to honor the contract," he said. "Not because I intend to break any of the financial terms. Those stand regardless. I don't want to honor the contract because honoring a contract means we were a contract, and I—" He stopped. "I am not willing to let what this has been be described by what it started as." She looked at him. The harbor moved. A boat somewhere to their left was heading out, its engine carrying across the water with the specific clarity of cold air. "Zion called me something last night," Min-jae said. "When I put him to bed, he said—" He stopped again, and this time she could see it cost him differently, the kind of cost that comes from something that matters too much to be said easily. "He said good night, the way he says it to you, the same word. He used it without thinking about it, and then he looked at me to see if it was wrong." She knew what word it was. She'd heard Zion working up to it for 3 weeks, in the way he worked up to things, all circling, approaching, retreating, the small courageous practice of a child deciding to trust something. "Was it wrong?" she said. "No," Min-jae said. His voice was quiet and completely unguarded. "It wasn't wrong." She looked at the water. She thought about Baltimore and the rice aisle, and the decision she'd made at 6:40 in the morning on an ordinary day that had turned out not to be ordinary at all. She thought about what the old man had said, "I'm not sorry that it was done," and the specific uncomfortable truth of that, the way it sat inside her alongside the equally specific truth of her anger at the engineering of it, and how both things were real simultaneously, and neither canceled the other. "The contract expires in 3 weeks, she said. "Yes." "And after that?" He turned to look at her fully. "After that is what we decide it is," he said. "Nothing automatic, nothing structural. A choice you make with all the information and without the financial pressure and without—" He paused. "Without the architecture I built around the choice you were given the first time." She looked at him for a long moment. The sea light, the unguarded face, the man underneath the legend, which turned out to be, like most things underneath most legends, both smaller and larger than the story. Smaller because he was just a person, flawed and exhausted and capable of tremendous wrongness, and larger because the flaws were the specific flaws of someone who had been trying, badly, to hold something together for a very long time. "I know," she said. "I know it's a real choice this time." He nodded. He looked back at Zion, who had successfully made contact with the second cat, and was now sitting cross-legged on the cold pier with both cats in his immediate vicinity and the expression of a person who has achieved something meaningful. "Min-jae," she said. "Yes." "Ask me again in 3 weeks." He looked at her. "When the contract is done," she said, "and it's just a question, ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face, not the half-smile she'd been cataloging for months, not the controlled, near expression, but something more complete, something that had been waiting behind the controlled surface for longer than she'd known him. "All right," he said. 3 weeks. They drove back to Seoul that evening with Zion asleep again across the back seat, this time with his head against the window and both cats safely in Busan, and the dinosaur book returned to his own hands. The old man had kept it for 2 hours before Min-jae's grandfather asked the nurse to return it to the boy, and Fatima had seen what was on the pages he'd had it open to. The ankylosaur, the armor that was part of the animal rather than applied to it, the protection that came from what you were made of rather than what you carried. She thought about that on the drive back. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, she was in the kitchen when Min-jae came in. The penthouse was different from what it had been in the first weeks. Not the physical space. The city still ran its light against the floor-to-ceiling glass. The Han River still caught the morning silver the same way. But the atmosphere of it, the specific human climate. Ji-young brought coffee at 7 and occasionally stayed to show Zion photographs of her sister's dog. The cook had started asking Zion what he wanted for dinner with the seriousness of a professional consulting a client, and Zion had responded by developing opinions. The household security still stood where they stood, but she knew their names now, and they knew her coffee order, and the particular shape of the silence they maintained had changed from professional wariness to something more like the silence of people who shared a space. She was looking at a document on her laptop when Min-jae came in. She'd been looking at it for 3 days, so a proposal for a non-profit structure, an immigrant services organization, the kind of framework that would take Korean bureaucracy and a degree of legal navigation she was still learning to manage, but that Denise had already started helping with remotely from Baltimore. Because Denise was the kind of person who met a problem by researching the applicable statutes. She heard him come in. She heard him stop. She didn't look up immediately. She finished the paragraph she was reading, then she looked up. He was standing at the edge of the kitchen in the morning light with no jacket, sleeves already rolled, and he was holding something in his right hand that he was very carefully not making a production of. Small, dark box. She looked at it. She looked at him. "The contract expired yesterday," he said. "I know." He set the box on the table between them. He didn't open it. He just set it there and put his hands in his pockets and looked at her with the face she'd learned over 11 months. The controlled surface and the real thing underneath it, and the specific way those two things related to each other, which was not the way she'd first read it. It was not coldness over warmth. It was protection over something that had never stopped being present, that had been present since a rice aisle and a plain white card, and a 14-hour flight, and a boy who fell asleep with a book on his chest. "No contracts," he said. "No deadlines. No obligations to anyone except the two of us and Zion." He paused. "No Chongya, no Taehyun, no grandfather engineering outcomes." He looked at her steadily. "Just a question." She looked at the box on the table. She thought about the woman who had stood in a grocery store 8 months ago with a basket of rice and a photograph of her son on her phone case and a card she had no reason to take. She thought about the recklessness of what she'd done and the reasons behind it and the price she'd paid along the way. The anger and the fear and the night she'd stood in a hallway and heard herself described as temporary, and the morning she'd sat at this table and told him what he had taken from her and watched him have nothing to say back. She thought about the fact that she was still here, not because of the contract, not because of the financial terms, not because there was nowhere to go, because there was always somewhere to go. Baltimore still existed. Mrs. Patterson was still downstairs. Denise had a fold-out couch that Fatima had slept on before and could sleep on again. She was still here because of the things she'd refused to name for 8 months. The thing she'd been putting in a box and placing on a high shelf. The thing that had been growing with such quiet persistence that it had eventually become too large for the box. She picked up the small dark case. She opened it. The ring was not what she'd expected. Not large, not declarative, not the kind of ring that announced itself. Simple. A single dark stone, understated. The kind of thing chosen by someone who had thought about the specific person rather than the general idea of a ring. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. Not with relief. Relief was for men who doubted. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had made a choice 6 months ago, 3 months ago, probably in the first weeks in ways he'd refused to acknowledge to himself, and was watching that choice arrive at its natural destination. He crossed the kitchen. He took the ring from the box in her hand and he put it on and it fit, which shouldn't have surprised her but did anyway. His hand closed around hers for a moment. "Zion's going to ask if this means he can get a dog," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The full version, the one she'd been watching arrive in increments since a museum in Seoul, and a boy reaching for a hand. Not a slight shift, not an almost. An actual smile, small and real and entirely his own. "Probably," he said. The months that followed were not a different kind of life. That was what she understood eventually. Not that the hard things went away, but that the shape of them changed, the way the same weight feels different when you're carrying it with both hands instead of one. The nonprofit took 18 months to get operational. The Korean bureaucracy was, as predicted, an education in patience that she did not always pass. Denise flew over for 3 weeks in the spring, and they sat at the kitchen table until midnight 3 nights in a row, going through structural documents and arguing the way they'd been arguing since Howard University, which was loudly and with great precision and without any permanent injury. Min-jae built the legitimate business structure from the Cheongya assets with the methodical care of a man who understood that the thing he was building was going to have to withstand scrutiny in a way the previous structure never had to. And this turned out to require more time and more patience and more legal architecture than either of them had initially estimated. He worked long hours. He came home for dinner. He rinsed his coffee cups and also sometimes left them on the counter. And she had stopped noting which he did because the fact of him being in the kitchen at all had long since ceased to register as something to catalog. Taehyun took Cheongya and spent 3 years consolidating it, and then spent 2 more years managing the cascading consequences of having what he'd wanted, which was exactly what the old man had predicted, which Fatima noted privately and did not say aloud because saying it aloud would have served nothing except the petty satisfaction of being right. And she had enough to be satisfied about without that. Chairman Kang Myung-soo lived 14 months after Busan. He died on a morning in autumn in the house above the sea, and Min-jae was there, and Fatima was there, and Zion sat outside in the overgrown garden with the harbor visible below and named every dinosaur he could think of in order of time period, which was how he processed things that were too large to process in words, and no one asked him to stop. Zion grew. He grew the way children grow when they are allowed to, which is in all directions simultaneously, upward in the obvious way, and outward in all the ways that mattered, the language and the friendships and the specific confidence of a child who had been carried across an ocean and discovered that the ground on the other side could hold him too. He spoke Korean with an accent that his classmates found endearing and that Min-jae corrected with patient precision in the evenings over dinner. He kept asking about the dog. They eventually got the dog. It was small and had very large ears, and Zion named it without consulting anyone, and the name he chose was Ankylosaur, which everyone shortened to Anki. And it was the dog that greeted Min-jae at the door every evening with an enthusiasm that Min-jae received with the specific dignified pleasure of a man who had decided that some things were beneath his level of control, and he was not interested in changing them. On a spring morning 2 years after the kitchen and the ring, Fatima stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows with her coffee and looked out at the Han River doing what it always did, catching the light, moving everything that fell into it toward somewhere else. And she felt the particular texture of a life that had been built, rather than inherited, the specific weight and warmth of something you had made with your own hands out of improbable materials. She heard Min-jae in the kitchen behind her, the sound of the coffee machine, the specific domestic geography of a morning she knew. She heard Zion's door, his footsteps, his voice asking something about breakfast before he'd fully arrived in the room, the question preceding him like a calling card. She heard Min-jae's answer, low, direct, the patient tone he reserved for Zion that was different from every other tone he used for every other thing, that had been different since a museum and a skeletal hand extended and a child reaching up without ceremony. She turned around. The kitchen was ordinary. Morning light, coffee smell, Zion climbing onto the counter stool and reaching for the cereal without waiting to be invited, Enki circling his stool with the hope of something falling. Min-jae at the counter. The apartment arranging itself around the morning the way the apartment had been arranging itself around their mornings for 2 years now. She looked at it and felt its specific weight. A black woman from Baltimore who had once stood in a grocery store with nothing but a basket and a reckless impulse. A Korean man who had spent decades becoming something his grandfather feared and had eventually, at considerable cost, decided to become something else instead. A boy who had crossed an ocean in his Orioles cap with his dinosaur books and made friends with every member of a household staff and a harbor cat and a council member's guard dog, and had eventually, without ceremony, in the dark of a Busan evening, said a word that meant everything. The city outside was doing what cities do, living indifferently and enormously, carrying its millions of separate lives through another ordinary morning. The river caught the light the same way it always did. Fatima walked into the kitchen. Move over, she said to Zion. She reached past him for the coffee Min-jae had already poured for her, the right amount, the right temperature, without being asked. Zion moved over. He was telling Min-jae something about cereal. Min-jae was listening with the focused attention he gave to everything Zion considered worth explaining. She stood between them and drank her coffee, and the morning did what mornings do. It continued. That was enough. That was, she thought, exactly enough.